searching history for buried classics. This is Lost Treasures of Gaming.
Welcome back, everybody, to Lost Treasures of Gaming. We have a treat for you, but first, I am your host, Sean Evans, otherwise known as Zion-Tane.
And I'm your other host, Sid Bolton, otherwise known as a lot of things. I'm Dirk the Daring online, but I'm also your gaming archaeologist on the OMG Hour.
Sid, we have a treat today, don't we?
We do. You know, there's so many great lost treasures out there, but when we come across a situation like this, it's even more special to actually, talk to someone who really is a founding father of video games in a certain way. And when I say that, it might make you think of someone like Nolan Bushnell or someone else like that, but it's not him.
It's not him. It's somebody close to him, though.
But it's somebody close to him, and somebody that maybe doesn't always get the recognition that he should, and that's kind of interesting because recognition is going to be one of the topics tonight, I think. That's going to be very important.
Yes, it is. Of course, we are talking about Warren Robinett, who is the creator and the programmer of Adventure for the Atari 2600, which came out, Sid, when you and I were 8 years old.
Yeah, pretty young.
Yeah.
I didn't get a chance to play it when it came out. I didn't play it until many, many years later. But very, very important. And, of course, based upon, one of the very first video games ever made for a mainframe, which was in text form. We're going to find out a little bit more about that. And also a lot of firsts, actually, with this game and other things. So it's interesting to talk to Warren.
It is, and we get a little bit of background on what it was like to work at Atari at the time, and it may not be all of the sunshine and roses that you think it was at the time. We get some very interesting stories from Warren. What a great guy! And so, without further ado, here is Warren Robinett, the creator of Adventure for the Atari 2600. Warren, thank you so much for joining us on Lost Treasures of Gaming. It's an absolute pleasure having you on.
You're welcome.
We want to talk to you today, actually, about Adventure, an old game from way back in the Atari 2600 days. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Adventure itself, how it came to be, and I personally would love to know, what was it like working for Atari back in the day?
Okay, well, I could take up the whole 30 minutes, right? Well, let's see. How did it come to be? I think it's kind of hard to take you and your listeners back to that era because video games were new. They weren't very highly developed. It was to me, it was an interesting, cool, new thing, but it wasn't very impressive in the early days. The games were pretty silly. The resources were really limited. It was just these little blocky graphics, like Pong or Breakout. Do you know those games?
Oh, absolutely.
Of course.
We're old as well.
Yeah. So, all right. Adventure was released 36 years ago. So I can tell you that I didn't have any concept where I was going to be 36 years later. But I don't think it ever occurred to me that I'd be being interviewed for this game I was working on because I didn't know it was going to be a big hit. I had an idea that I thought that I got excited about, and so let's see. I'm rambling. Do you want me to give you a summary or something?
Just tell us whatever you'd like. I mean, this is a free reign show, so.
Well, I prefer dialogues actually, so you can break in and
of course
conversation if you want to. So your question was, where did Adventure come from?
Yeah, how did you come up with the idea of doing this game?
Well, so I I was interested in computer graphics when I was an undergraduate. I went to Rice, and then I went to graduate school in computer science at Berkeley, California. That's how I got out to California, where Atari is located. I was pretty well trained, which is one of the reasons I was able to do that game in the limited resources. It was not easy to pack the stuff that I packed into a 4K ROM memory. But your question was, why did I do it? I had done one game already on the Atari 2600, which was called Slot Racers. That was my first game. It's really kind of a learning experience. It wasn't that great of a game, but luckily all the Atari game designers were learning what was possible on the Atari 2600. So it was released. And then I was looking for another idea. Back in those days, each Atari video game was on the home game machine, the Atari 2600, was done by one person. So you had the idea, you wrote the program, you did the graphics, you made the sounds, you tested it on kids, you decided when it was done, you turned it in, and it was manufactured. So it's rather unlike the way video games are made nowadays, from what I understand.
Sure. And what kind of time frame would that end up being, that a whole course that you just mentioned?
Well, considering that there's only 4K of memory in these things, 4K bytes, 4,096 bytes, it didn't take that long to write enough code. The games are written in assembly language. You could fill up the ROM in 2 or 3 weeks of coding. So you had to carefully spend your bytes of memory. My first game took 5 months, Slot Racers.
Yep.
And Adventure took a year in total, although I got stuck halfway through it and took a break for 2 months to try and figure out some things and then resume working on it.
Well, that's actually a fairly long time for that era for a game to be in development, wouldn't you say? Because most of the people we've talked to for games around that era, they're talking, it was like a couple of months and it was done. But for something of that era to take a year, that's actually pretty substantial, I would think.
Yeah, I think it took a little bit longer than most things, but most VCS games, according to my knowledge, didn't take a couple months. Todd Fry did one in 6 weeks, but it was E.T., but it was a very good game. They mostly took 4 to 6 months, I would say.
Okay.
But that was in the 2K era. Then the amount of memory doubled to 4K, so that might have made it. I actually quit right after I did Adventure, so I don't know what the statistics were after that. You have to ask somebody else about that. So, want me to keep going?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, let's see. Before I forget, I'm going to go off on a tangent for a second. Have I told you that I'm right now working on a book about the implementation of Adventure?
No, that's interesting.
Okay, well, so you can use your podcast to announce it if you want. I did talk about it a little bit when I gave a talk at the Game Designers Conference last March, but my book is called The Annotated Adventure, and it's about the implementation of Adventure. So the target audience is programmers. It's a technical book because it's about the program, how I implemented it. But I do have a first part that's non-technical. I decided to organize the book kind of like an onion, where the outer layer is about the ideas and why I did what I did. And then the middle layer is I translated the assembly language version of Adventure into C, because I thought there were a lot more C programmers in the world than there are 6502 assembly language programmers. So that's supposed to be more comprehensible when you can use a language that you use daily or whatever to look at the code. And then the inner layer is looking at the actual assembly language code and how I did it in detail. So, if any of you, what fraction of your listeners are technical, would you say?
Oh, honestly, I don't know, but I think a lot of them are.
Well, anyway, I'm not.
We certainly are.
Yeah,
Okay.
we sure are.
Okay. Well, anyway, it's not finished yet, but I hope to have it out by the end of the year. And if anyone who is interested can email me, my email address is Warren at warrenrobinett.com. No E on the end of Robinette. And you send me an email with annotated in the subject line, you'll get put on the list to be notified.
Awesome. That's exciting.
Do that right.
You know what? I've been working on this for almost a year. It's more trouble to describe how I did it than it was to do it.
Well, it did take you a year to create the game too, so
yeah,
maybe they're mimicking each other there.
Now the game
less equal at this point, but I haven't finished the book, have I?
That's right.
Now the game is, you might describe it as a graphical representation of sort of the original text adventure. So did you did you play that on mainframe, or how did that connection start for you?
Yeah. So Atari was based in Sunnyvale, California, and I lived in Menlo Park, California, which is right next to Stanford. And so I had done my first video game, Slot Racers, which was released for Christmas 1978. I was looking for a new game idea when I was finishing up Slot Racers in early 1978. And my housemate, Julius Smith, who was a grad student at Stanford at that time, he took me over to the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab where he worked, and there was this new game everybody was talking about. It's what we now call Colossal Cave, the original text adventure.
Yep.
Created by Willie Crowther and Don Woods. Don Woods was a grad student at Stanford also at that time. And everybody was playing this thing, and Julius had heard about it, and so we spent an afternoon playing it. I made a map, like people always do, of the game, as much of the game world as I just explored. And I guess a lot of your readers maybe know what a text adventure game is, but I'm just going to describe it real briefly. There's no graphics. You get a paragraph of text that described where you were, and then you'd type in a command like go north, and then you'd be somewhere else in the game world, and it would describe where you were. You're in a cave rim with frozen rivers of orange stone. Columns of mists sway to and fro as if alive. Something like that. Woods kind of hammed it up when he was writing this thing. The writing was pretty good, actually, but the interactive aspect of moving through this game world was what it was really about. Then if you came across an object, like you go into a new chamber, and it says, there's a cheerful little bird sitting here singing. Okay, and then you could say, take bird, and you'd be carrying the bird. And then later on, turns out the bird was useful for something, right? You could use it to get past one of the obstacles. So this original text adventure that I played was all text, no graphics at all. You read descriptions on the screen. You typed in short little commands, go north, go east, pick up the bird, release the bird, wave the wand. There were some cool magic words. That's what inspired me to do adventure. And I was a video game designer making these visual, animated games with sounds and a joystick. There's no keyboard for the Atari 2600. So I thought it was the coolest thing I ever saw, this text adventure game. And I thought that it would be possible to make a version of that on the Atari video game. And so I decided that was what I was going to do. This is the story.
So you did.
Here, right? Huh?
And so you did.
Well, yes, but there were a few bumps in the road. Like, Atari was kind of it was rather, you'd have to call it kind of an anarchy, or another way you could describe it was a bunch of individual labors of love, because people that worked there thought they had pretty cool jobs. None of us knew where the video game industry was going to go, but it was sure fun to get paid to make these electronic games. So Nolan Bushnell had created the company, and he set up a pretty loose environment. It was the mid-'70s. Everybody had beards and long hair, flannel shirts, blue jeans. We looked like hippies, but we were hard-working hippies, most of us, because it was interesting designing these games. So back then, I told you already that it was one designer, one game type situation. There was no committees. There were no proposals. Matter of fact, Larry Kaplan, who was my boss when I first started there, first day of work, he said, "Your job is to design games. Now go design one."
And that's it.
That's it. Well, no, that wasn't quite it. He told me that everybody in marketing was an idiot. But engineers and marketing people are like cats and dogs. They don't understand each other.
Oil and water, for sure.
Yeah. Anyway.
Now, how much of that development time, like obviously, the 4K was, bigger than other games at the time, but that's how much what you're describing when you talk about the 4K is how big the actual program gets to be. Now, one of the things about the Atari 2600 and the graphics
and the sounds.
But one of the other real big limiting factors with the 2600 was there wasn't a lot of RAM to do things. There wasn't a lot of places where you could store, the cartridge ROM is stuff that doesn't change. So you needed to be able to have space to keep things that are variable as you go along. That, for example, the score and things like that. If you had a game that had a score, how much time did you have to spend dealing with the limitations of the 2600 itself in terms of that sort of stuff? It's hard to quantify it in one sense, but...
No, I can quantify it. I spent all my time dealing with the limitations of the 2600 because you were constantly faced with limitations in every single thing you wanted to do. And one thing that I've realized, I've had 3.5 decades to meditate over what happened. I was lucky that I was well trained when I got a job at Atari. I had studied computer stuff at Rice, where I was an undergraduate, and then I got a master's degree in computer science at Berkeley. I was lucky enough to take a course from Ken Thompson, one of the co-inventors of Unix and the programming language C. So I learned C from one of the inventors of it at a very early point. And I think you could say that when I was working at Atari, even though I was programming in an assembly language, I learned to think like a C programmer.
Right.
So, for example, that thinking like a C programmer, one thing it means is that you're very comfortable using pointers, okay? And it's a lot easier to design data structures in C than it was in some of the languages that came before that. So that's one of the reasons I was able to do Adventure is I designed several different data structures specifically to make this rooms and objects thing fit into the tiny memories of the 2600.
Right. Yeah, because I can imagine that was just really, really difficult to do what you did in that limited amount of space. So that's why I was curious just how much time you spent trying to do that part of it.
It was definitely challenging, and that's why I decided to write this book, because not only is... Adventure, I think, is considered to be the first action-adventure game. And so I think, I'm biased, of course, but I think it's interesting from a couple different points of view. One is that I'm trying to make a history of why and how I implemented the first one of this genre of video games. But the game is also sort of a poster child for resource-limited programming.
Right.
Because I think I said there were a few bumps in the road to get to the finished game. The first bump was I worked on it for a couple of weeks, and then the guy who was my boss, it wasn't Larry Kaplan anymore, my boss he knew something about the text adventure games, and what he knew was that it took 100K on a mainframe, the program did, and he knew that we only had 4K on the 2600, so he decided that meant it was impossible, and he told me it was impossible. Don't work on it. So what do you think? What do you think I did?
You worked
harder,
of course.
Yeah, yes.
Worked harder to prove him wrong.
Well, I was excited, and I guess it's one of my personality characteristics. I know when I have a good idea, and when somebody tells me not to work on my good idea, it makes me crazy. So I didn't tell him that I was going to defy him. I just kept working on it. People kept weird hours at Atari back in that era, and this guy was a bit older. He came to work from 8 to 5 or whatever. So it was pretty easy to work at night and do whatever I wanted. And so, but I thought I'd better produce something pretty fast. So I worked my butt off for about a month, maybe 6 weeks to make a first prototype. Because on the Atari 2600, you had to make this thing called the kernel that was the display routine. And then I had to figure out how am I going to display objects and rooms and where I am in the game world. So the Atari 2600 had these little things called sprites. They're kind of old-fashioned nowadays, but they were little hardware components that would let you make little moving patches of the screen move around easily.
Yeah.
And so anyway, there were 5 sprites, and there was the one low-resolution background. So my original idea was I knew how I was going to do it. There were 2 high-resolution sprites. I was going to use them to display objects in the room you were in. I was going to use the low-resolution background to display the walls of the room you were in, and the walls were going to block your motion. I was going to use the so-called ball sprite to show your own location, what we'd call an avatar nowadays. So that was my design for the display. Walls for the background, a little square for yourself, your avatar, because I had already allocated my good sprites for displaying objects. And a result of this decision and the resources that I had on 2600 were, if there are more than 2 objects in the room you were in, how am I going to display them? Well, they blinked. I just displayed 2, and then the next video frame I displayed 2 more, and I just kept going round robin until I displayed them all. So it's ugly, to tell you the truth, the blinking. It's irritating, but I just accepted that as a limitation of the 2600 and didn't lose any sleep over it.
That's awesome. Now, there is one other thing that Adventure is well known for creating, and that is the Easter egg.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because you hid, in one of the rooms, you hid the created by Warren Robinett Easter egg.
Yeah.
What was the reason behind wanting to do that?
Yeah. Well, so Atari had been bought by a big East Coast corporation, Warner Communications. It's what is nowadays Time Warner Cable. Okay?
Yep.
It's still a big media conglomerate 35 years later.
Even despite owning Atari during its bad time.
Yeah, well, yeah, they bought Atari. They made $500 million worth of profit. They treated all the game designers like shit. We all quit. And then they lost $500 million in 1 year. Oh. And then they dumped Atari, so they actually came out even, more or less. But you could also say that they squandered, they squandered what they had. There wouldn't have been a Nintendo in the form we know it if Atari hadn't been blown apart by mismanagement. Of course, I'm biased. The reason I made the Easter egg, I didn't call it an Easter egg. I called it my signature. And
it became known as an Easter egg later on.
Yeah. And the reason I did it is because there was a power play going on. Warner Communication would not give us any public credit, us being the Atari 2600 game designers. So it was really clear how it was working because Slot Racers had come out for Christmas 1978 and it said, Slot Racers by Atari. No mention of me on the box, on the manual, in the game,
Yeah.
So I guess they thought that if the programmers got any recognition, they might start asking for things like royalties and, so they were just going to suppress us. So that was the background, and that pissed me off. So,
well, they told you something you couldn't do, right? That's the whole point. They told you couldn't do something.
And this was before the split of several people like David Crane going off to form Activision, correct? Like this happened
it was for Atari.
Years before that.
No, more or less, it was 1 or 2 years before that.
1 or 2 years? Okay.
It's the same reason that they left
Right.
to start Activision. But it wasn't just Dave Crane. It was Dave Crane, Larry Kaplan, Bob Whitehead, and Al Miller left to start Activision. And they were like they had done half the titles for the 2600 when or at least somebody showed them the sales figures, and they looked over the list and realized that the 4 of them accounted for more than half of Atari's $100 million in sales, or whatever it was, in 1979. And they went to talk to Ray Kassar, the CEO of Atari, and to see if they might get a little piece of those gigantic profits. And Ray Kassar said, "You guys are no more important to Atari than the guy on the assembly line who puts together the packages that are sent to Sears."
Wow.
So they said, they may have said some bad words to Ray, or not, I don't know what they said, but within a year they were gone. They started a competing company.
And even though none of them are there now, Activision is the biggest entertainment software company in the world. Now, Now, with being combined with Blizzard, it's bigger than Electronic Arts. Now, you didn't just you left Atari fairly early on, one might say. Now, but you went and did something interesting. You formed the Learning Company. How did that come about?
Well, yeah. So I was a co-founder of the Learning Company. My other three co-founders were 3 women who were educators. The way it came about was when I was working. So let's go back to Atari, because that's really part of the story. So I was doing this game, Adventure. I was pretty excited about it. I had to fight to do it. My boss forbade me to do it. And then when it actually seemed like I could do it on the 2600, did he say, "Well, you were right, Warren, you could do it"? No, he was mad that I had defied him, right? So he told me things like, "You were hard to direct." This guy just did not understand how things worked at Atari. The young designers had ideas, and then they went and implemented them. So he was treating me like a bad employee, okay? And I thought what I was doing was pretty good. The internal people at Atari would play the games that were under development. The time I was there were only about a dozen game programmers making games for the 2600. So the people that wrote the manuals, and some of the marketing people, and some of the secretaries, and just people that worked there in the same area that the programmers did, they would play the game. So they're pretty good, they were a sophisticated audience. And so the internal playtesters, informal playtesters, they liked Adventure. I was getting really good vibes from them. Jay Miner, one of the head hardware designer for the VCS, picked me up and gave me a hug when he saw Adventure for the first time.
I've met Jay. He was such a great man. I can see him doing that.
Yeah, he's a cool guy. So I was getting treated as a bad employee, and I thought I was doing a good job. They were making me anonymous, but I had an answer to that. I hid my signature in the game. That's the Easter egg you're asking me about. And then I just got kind of demoralized. You think you're doing good work, but you're being told you're a bad employee. So I did finish the game, Adventure. I didn't want somebody else to finish it. Then they would have found my little secret, wouldn't they have?
Right.
Yes.
And I was actually working on 2 things simultaneously. I also finished another cartridge called Basic Programming. I actually did Adventure and Basic Programming simultaneously in that 1-year period. So I finished both of the cartridges I'd been working on and turned them in, and then I quit. And this guy, George Simcock, who was my boss, I remember when I told him I quit, he smiled.
Oh, no.
This is a pre-Dilbert era, but it kind of, anyway.
Was this the same guy who said you were hard to direct?
Yeah.
Okay.
So they didn't treat me well. I made 3 cartridges for Atari in 18 months while I worked there. It was an interesting time, but I quit. They treated me bad. I quit. So then I went off and went back to my hometown in Missouri for a few months, and I went off to Europe with a backpack and traveled around for a few months and just kind of, rested, relaxed. But after I'd had enough of relaxing and visiting friends and relatives, I went back to California, right? Silicon Valley was pretty obviously that was the place to go back to and get another job. And I was kind of networking around, I guess you'd say. I made a proposal to the world's one and only software marketing company. Its big product back then was VisiCalc, the first spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
And I made a proposal to do a game, an adventure type game for them, and but they didn't accept my proposal. But the guy who worked there, who later on became famous, Mitch Kapoor, the founder of Lotus, was just one of the guys working at Personal Software at that time. There's another couple of people who had made a proposal to him to make educational games, and he turned down both of our proposals, mine and theirs, but he decided to introduce me to them. And so that's how I met my partner, Anne McCormick Pystrup, who she and I were 2 of the co-founders of the Learning Company, and Anne found 2 other educators. So Terry Pearl and Leslie Grimm were the other 2 co-founders. And in 1980, Anne went and found some venture capital, and we started the company. And Anne's original partner, who was there at the first meeting I had with her, was actually Steve Jobs' girlfriend.
Oh, wow.
Barbara Jasinski. Okay, so Anne was sort of she had a way of getting through the world, and not only did she have Steve Jobs' girlfriend as her partner, she had Steve Jobs' personal lawyer as her lawyer. So you can maybe get an idea of how she did things. It's not how I did things, but Anne and I were complementary to each other, let's say. And so Anne right after I first met her, Anne got a grant from the National Science Foundation to make educational games, a grant for $130,000, which is enough to support several people for a year back then. And Steve Jobs told his girlfriend, Barbara, that if the government was paying for it, they'd own it, and don't do it. So she walked away. How about that?
Oh, boy. Now, eventually, the Learning Company got acquired by SoftKey, and for those that don't know, I happen to be a fan of Dragon's Den and Shark Tank, but the founder of SoftKey was Kevin O'Leary. So, so did you deal with Kevin directly yourself, or how did that?
No, I didn't stay all that long at the Learning Company either. I stayed there 3 years, but it was long enough to make the flagship product, which was called Rocky's Boots, and we made a few other products too. And I quit after 3 years, and it was about 6 or 8 or maybe 10 years later that Kevin O'Leary came into the picture.
Okay, so it was quite a bit longer. Okay,
a lot longer.
A lot longer.
Well,
yeah, in the mid 90s, I think. Yeah, right. So okay, so much later.
We started in 80.
Now, did you leave any Easter eggs or signatures, I should say, in any of those other games? But I mean, I guess you would have had your name on them. But did you do anything else like that where you put secret things in there?
I thought I would have my name on them, and I did when I was working there, and I was still a founder. But later on, when it became corporate, they took the names of the creators off the products. So one thing
that must have just drove you crazy.
Well, no, because I made some money from the Learning Company since I was a founder. So the experience having several years worth of salary dumped on you tends to ease the pain quite a bit, if you see what I mean.
Right. Of course.
So after that, then, like, how long did you stay in the gaming industry after the Learning Company?
I didn't.
That was it?
Well, I didn't expect to walk away. I just had hit 2 home runs in my last 2 at-bats, Adventure and Rocky's Boots. But it was very stressful starting a company. I didn't believe in stress back then. I thought it was all in your head, but that was kind of a foolish point of view. So I actually had some neck trouble after 3 years of being in this startup company. I got sucked into a fight between Ann, who was the founder and chairman, and a guy named Jack, who's the president of the company. And there were various other ups and downs type thing. And I was just stressed out. My neck was all seized up, and I couldn't turn my head further than about 5 degrees in each direction. So I decided, no amount of money is worth ruining your body.
Yeah.
So
what do you find yourself doing these days?
Well, I'm writing this book.
Yes.
This year. So that question encompasses 35 years, you understand?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, like you said, we could be here for hours, but we've already kept you for 30 minutes.
Well, I'll give you a real short version of what happened next. I took 3 years off to recover from the stress of starting a company. I was writing a book during that a year and a half of that period, and I had a publisher, but unfortunately my publisher went out of business just as I finished my manuscript of the book, because it was the crash of the video game and software industries back in 83, 84. So the book never got published. So I got a manuscript laying around. So after the 3 years of resting up, I decided that I was ready to go back to work and do something. And I ended up getting a job at NASA Ames Research Center in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Nice.
And what I was working on was what we now call virtual reality.
No way.
Yeah. I had a pretty good nose for cool stuff, okay? And I knew a guy who was working on this there. I thought what it was called back then was a head-mounted display. There was no name for the experience. The term virtual reality was coined, though, around that time in the mid-'80s. And so we had, at NASA, we get the first glove in virtual reality. We had this motorcycle helmet that had 2 little Watchman-type TVs and some optics to let you see the screen's wide angle. So that was pretty fun to get a chance to work on virtual reality in the early days. And then I ended up leaving Ames and taking a job, and leaving California and moving to North Carolina to take a job in computer science department at the University of North Carolina, because I wanted to keep working in VR, and there were very few places you could do that, but one of them was this computer science department. So I still live here in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So I moved here in 1989. I didn't expect to leave California permanently, but that's what happened. A few years later, I got married, bought a house, had some kids. Been here ever since.
Awesome.
And here's a factoid that might allow you to see why it makes a certain amount of sense. Normal people can buy houses in North Carolina.
Right. Normal people, yes.
Well,
I understand.
You have to be Larry Ellison to buy a house in San Francisco or Palo Alto.
Yeah. Different kind of lifestyle, for sure.
Right.
For sure. Well, wow. It's and now that you're working on this book now about adventure, it's almost like, in a way, your career has come full circle. You're back to where you began. In some ways.
Well, I decided that one thing. So after my VR years, I actually spent a lot of the last 10 years living in North Carolina, but commuting to Palo Alto, California. I had a job working for Hewlett-Packard. The research arm of HP is called HP Labs. So I was working on a really interesting research project, but it had nothing to do with games. It had to do with computer hardware. I was in a group that discovered a new electronic component that HP is now trying to commercialize as memory. It's called the Memristor. You ever heard of that?
No.
Yeah, well, it doesn't have much, if anything, to do with the gaming world. But anyway, I spent 10 years working on this computer hardware thing, and I was writing papers and doing research on these hardware circuits. And one thing that I learned, and I was also a virtual reality researcher in a university for 15 years. So what you do if you're a researcher is you write papers. And one thing I learned during those years is that you can do something, do some experiment or create some piece of software, but if you don't write it up, it never happened. Okay?
Oh, okay.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Well, so you guys are a counterexample to that. You call me. You don't care whether I wrote any papers about it. But there is quite a bit of truth in this thing that it never happened if you don't write it up. And, I'm the only one who created the game, and I know why I did it, and I know how I did it. And I realized that the program was so short because it had to fit into this tiny memory that the program was short enough that it would be like 5% of a book just to write down the listing of the code. It's 25 pages long. That's about a tenth of a book, right?
Yeah.
5%. So the program for Adventure was short enough that you could actually explain everything in a book length work. So, I'm not going to be around forever. I decided if I was ever going to do that, now would be a good time to do it. And
yeah, especially while you can still remember everything too.
Yeah, well, I'm not senile.
Yeah, but you wrote that code a long time ago, and I mean, because and probably back then, because I know any code that I've written, like, if I go back and early code that I wrote, I would never put comments in it, so sometimes I go back and go, why did I do that way?
Bad programmer.
Well,
Bad programmer, but I mean, now I'm much more disciplined, but
I had lost.
I didn't have space a lot of times to put comments in. I actually wrote a Twitter client for the VIC-20 a few years ago just to prove it could be done in 3.5K. And my new, as a more mature program, when I originally wrote on the VIC-20, I would just, hit the hardware, write directly, wouldn't do any comments. When I went to write code in I think I did it in 2010 or 2009, of course, as a disciplined programmer, I was doing, I was putting all these comments in, not realizing halfway through my code that I was out of memory because the comments, of course, were taking up space. So it wasn't like I was compiling something and the comments would go away. In my case, the comments were eating away at the space. So out went the comments. The only comment in the program was just like you have done, Warren. I put my name in there, and that was it. The rest of it I had to get rid of. So I applaud you for being able to remember what you did back then, because that's pretty. I'd
lost the source code that I originally had back in the late 70s, but what you can do is, if you have the ROM, you can disassemble it and get a machine-produced disassembly of what's in the ROM. So I basically had to reconstruct how it worked.
Right.
I remember the high-level stuff, though.
Right, and again, because it was relatively small, being, like you said, 4K, that it's not like it would take you years and years to reconstruct everything, so.
It took longer than you might think, though.
No, I can imagine. That's still a lot of work, for sure.
Yeah. So.
Wow.
Well, how can people find you these days? You're on Twitter, right? Do you post a lot on Twitter?
Yeah. My brother told me I should be on Twitter, and I got a Twitter account, and I've posted once.
So people could follow you. They just think
they could. They're not going to get a lot of updates.
I haven't really come into the 21st century on that one. I have a website, warrenrobinett.com.
All right.
and that has my email address on it. You know, I do get a few fan emails from time to time, but not so many that it's irritating. So I answer people.
Yes.
Awesome.
So I'm not that hard to find. How'd you guys find me?
I found you just by looking for you. I don't remember exactly, but I was sort of just poking around thinking, I wonder if he's still around and what he's doing. And so, yeah, I think I stumbled across your website and your email address. So, and obviously you responded because here we are today. So thank you for that. And thank you for your contribution to the video game industry, starting a genre and having the distinction of the first Easter egg that you called a signature. So that's something that I learned today. So that's awesome. And your stories of the past are very interesting and very inspiring. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Get what you wanted?
Oh,
absolutely.
We appreciate you taking the time to be on Lost Treasures of Gaming. It's been awesome.
No problem.
Wow, what a great interview.
Yeah.
I had a lot of fun.
He's such a fountain of knowledge for sure. Obviously we could turn this into a 2-hour podcast easily by picking his brain about not only his days at Atari, but also the learning company. We talked, obviously briefly about that, but the learning company, was pretty big. I think a lot of people don't realize, if you weren't into computer games, you maybe don't understand the scale of that company and what it did and how often their products sold and how important they were for education. I think a lot of people don't really necessarily appreciate that because, computers being accepted into homes, it's very commonplace today. But back then, it was a much more difficult thing to get a computer into a home, and a lot of times having the ability to have educational software sort of made it justified for parents to invest in computers in homes, and I think that Warren's contribution to that really, quite honestly, is just as important as his contribution to the video game market, and I think that's something maybe people don't really get, but really should understand that, and maybe he doesn't even fully appreciate his contribution, but really. And talking about the virtual reality stuff and everything else, obviously the man was quite a bit ahead of his time.
Yeah, and what I found really surprising or I guess sad compared to today is just how what the stars of video games today are the people who create them. And yet back then they were treated like nobodies.
Right.
And it's kind of disheartening to realize that back then they didn't matter. All the company wanted was a video game, you know, and these people who created them, the actual artists behind these games, didn't matter. And,
Right. And I mean, he talked about, how the marketing people and the engineers didn't necessarily get along together, but what you also have to understand is that one of the standouts in this case is that, and certainly what he would fall under is not only did you have to be an engineer, but you also had to be a creative artist, right? He was talking about how one person did all this stuff. So, that's even more rare to find because today, you do have the engineer types that are just engineers and they work on the engineering part of a game, and then you have the artist types who just focus on the art in a game.
Yes.
And yes, that does.
And the sound designer and the
exactly
the writers and the actors.
Arguably, that produces maybe better games today, but not necessarily. I mean, you have to understand that it takes a special kind of person to be able to be both creative and technical, and be able to bring it all together and be focused enough to get something finished and out the door. So, really, truly, and you can understand why these guys, and they probably also had some pretty healthy egos because of that, and that's probably one of the reasons why. Let's face it, that's why Activision was formed and why, Warren ultimately ended up creating that Easter egg and why he left Atari.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that was a wonderful interview with Warren. Such a treat to have him on the show, and I hope everybody enjoyed listening. This has been another episode of Lost Treasures of Gaming. Of course, those of you who know me know that I'm doing Extra Life. This is my 6th year of doing it, raising funds for Children's Miracle Network of Hospitals. If you are able to donate to this worthy cause, visit bit.ly/extra-Sean, and Sean is S-E-A-N. That would be awesome. I'm looking to raise, I'd like to raise $1,500. I'm just shy of 1,000 right now, which is pretty awesome.
That's great.
And it is next Saturday, November 7th, that I'll be doing 24 hours nonstop of gaming, and I will be streaming all of it to my either Twitch or YouTube channel. I'm not quite sure which yet. Now that I have
Sean doing Extra Life, so I don't have to. That's very
exciting. There you go. Well, thank you, everybody, for listening to Lost Treasures of Gaming. Don't forget to visit GamingHistory101.com every Friday as Fred puts together a new video based on the game that we just talked about. So when he is able to, if he's able to actually record himself playing the game we talk about, he is going to post a follow-up video in a partnership with us, and it's pretty awesome.
It'll be really difficult too, but maybe, just maybe, he might actually stumble across that Easter egg in the game. If he does, I'll be very impressed, and I don't know, I'll send them a cookie or something like that. But that's a pretty tough challenge, so I don't expect you to do that. But that'd be really, really cool if he did.
So while you can follow Lost Treasures of Gaming on Twitter, we are at Lost Treasures OG. I am Zion Tane, pretty much everywhere.
And I'm Sid Bolton. You can find me on Twitter at Sid Bolton. That's Sid with a Y. And if you want to send us an email, maybe send us your comments, or if you have an idea for someone that we should interview for the show, send us an email to losttreasuresofgaming@gmail.com. And you can also read the show notes, find out how to subscribe to updated information from Warren and any other information that we have at our show notes, which you can find at our website, which is, of course, omgnexus.com.
Well, that's it. Be sure to listen to the next episode of the OMG Hour to get a preview of what next week's Buried Classic might be. So without further ado, we'll talk to you again next time.
See you soon.
This has been an OMGNexus.com production.